The chandelier caught the candlelight, but Greg demanded all the shine. He stood at the head of the table, swirling a vintage cabernet he hadn't paid for, his face flushed with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his own press. I watched the performance silently. Then came the moment. My brother-in-law raised his glass. I am flipping the family beach house easy profit. I smiled. He didn't know I bought that house years ago. He didn't know the contractor waiting outside was furious. My father clapped until his palms stung, beaming at the son he never had. Beside him, my mother whispered about how Greg was finally securing their legacy. It was a masterclass in delusion. My sister, Chloe, squeezed Greg's hand, looking desperate. She knew they were drowning, yet she sat there nodding along to his fiction. I cut into my steak, the serrated knife sliding through the meat with satisfying ease. They saw a savior standing there. I saw a parasite looking for a host. "We're going open concept," Greg announced, gesturing grandly. "That old mahogany deck? Gone. We need composite materials. Low maintenance means high resale value." My stomach tightened. That deck was hand-milled by my grandfather 60 years ago. It was the heart of the home, seasoned by salt air and memories. Greg spoke about tearing it apart like he was taking out the trash. He wasn't just renovating a building. He was erasing our history to build a generic listing photo. The disrespect made my blood run cold. "Megan, take notes." My father chuckled. "You might learn something about real investment." I took a sip of water to wash down the insult. To them, I was just the quiet accountant who bored everyone at parties. They didn't know I purchased the beach house deed 5 years ago when Dad missed his property taxes. I saved them silently then. And I was the only thing standing between them and homelessness now. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a vault where I kept their darkest secrets. My phone vibrated against the table, a sharp buzz cutting through Greg's monologue about marble countertops. I glanced down, shielding the screen. It was a message from Marco, the contractor Greg had illegally hired. The image loaded, and I nearly dropped my fork. It was a photo of a sledgehammer smashing through the dining room wall. The caption read, "I am done waiting. I am taking my deposit out of the drywall." The renovation hadn't started next week like Greg claimed. He had already unleashed absolute chaos. "Excuse me," I said, pushing my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor, interrupting Greg mid-sentence. "Duty calls." My mother sighed, disappointed I was walking away from her golden boy. "Always working, Megan. Can't you just enjoy the family success?" I didn't answer. I couldn't tell her there was no success, only a crime scene in progress. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. The rain pounded against the glass. I wasn't going for dessert. I was going to stop a demolition. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing the warmth of the dining room from the biting reality outside. Rain slashed sideways, stinging my cheeks like tiny needles of ice. At the end of the paved drive, a silhouette leaned against a battered work truck. The engine was running, coughing gray exhaust into the wet night air. I pulled my wool coat tighter and marched toward the figure. Marco wasn't just waiting. He was vibrating with an anger that felt volatile. He stepped into the harsh light of the motion sensor, his work boot splashing in a puddle. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap, masking the fury in his dark eyes. "I don't want to talk to the sister-in-law." Marco spat, his voice rough as gravel. "I want the guy who signs the checks. Or rather, the guy who bounces them." He took a menacing step forward. He dodged my calls all week. "Tell him I'm done asking nicely." I held up a hand, trying to act as a barrier between him and the house. "Keep your voice down," I hissed. "My parents are inside." Marco laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "I don't care who's inside. Your brother-in-law ordered a rush job on that deck. I got guys out there right now tearing up 60-year-old mahogany in the dark because he promised a bonus." My heart skipped a beat. They were actively destroying my history tonight. Stop the crew, I commanded, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound composed. Call them off right now. Marco shook his head, crossing his thick arms over a chest that looked like a barrel. No cash, no breaks. I am 5,000 in the hole for materials and labor. My guys have families to feed. If Greg doesn't walk out here with a certified check in 10 minutes, I am letting them strip the copper wiring out of the walls. I reached into my purse, bypassing my wallet and pulling out a folded document I carried for this exact nightmare scenario. Greg can't pay you, I said, my tone shifting from defensive to authoritative. Because Greg doesn't own the house. I shoved the paper against his chest. He grabbed it, squinting under the dim floodlight. It was a photocopy of the deed, stamped and notarized. I am the owner, I clarified. And I never authorized you to touch a single board. The rain soaked the paper, but the legal seal was unmistakable. Marco lowered the document, his aggression draining away to be replaced by confusion. If you own it, he murmured, looking back at the house where warm light spilled from the windows. Then, who is the buyer? He wiped his wet face. Greg showed me a contract. He said he took a $50,000 cash deposit from a developer yesterday. He said that money was for the renovation. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Greg hadn't just stiffed a contractor. He had taken a deposit on a property that wasn't his to sell. He was running a Ponzi scheme with my inheritance. There is no developer, I said, the realization settling in my gut like lead. He pocketed that cash. Marco looked at me, then at the house. This wasn't just unauthorized renovation anymore. It was felony fraud, and I needed the paper trail. The silence in my home office at 3 a.m. was heavier than the rainstorm I had left behind. My wet coat lay in a heap by the door, dripping onto the hardwood like a ticking clock. I sat before my dual monitors, the blue light stinging my tired eyes. This was my domain. Out there, Greg could charm parents and bluff contractors. But in here, numbers didn't lie. I took a sip of cold coffee and cracked my knuckles. It was time to perform the autopsy on my brother-in-law's finances. I started with a standard asset search, the kind I usually reserved for corporate embezzlement cases. The results populated the screen in a waterfall of red text. Greg wasn't just broke, he was insolvent. His luxury sedan was 3 months behind on lease payments. His own home, the one he bragged about renovating last summer, had 2 separate tax liens against it. He had been projecting the image of a tycoon, while quietly boarding up the windows of his actual life. The facade was made of paper, and I had the match. I shifted my focus to joint accounts, praying I wouldn't find what I expected. My stomach dropped as the credit report loaded. Chloe's name was attached to 5 maxed-out credit cards, all opened in the last 6 months. The balances were staggering, totaling nearly $80,000. He had weaponized her credit score to float his lifestyle. She was probably signing the slips without looking, trusting the husband, who promised them the world. He was systematically dismantling her future to buy time for his ego. I needed to find the source of the $50,000 Greg had given Marco. Greg claimed it was a deposit from a developer, but no legitimate buyer hands over cash without a title search. I pulled up the LLC registration for the company, listed on the wire transfer Greg had forwarded to his personal account. Apex Capital Solutions. Wasn't a property developer. A quick cross-reference with the State Business Bureau revealed the ugly truth. They were a hard money lender known for predatory rates and aggressive collections. I accessed the loan documents filed with the county clerk. The terms were draconian. It was a bridge loan with a 40% interest rate, compounding weekly. Greg had borrowed the money against the future sale of the beach house. A property he didn't own. He had essentially sold a bridge he didn't possess to a toll collector who broke kneecaps for a living. The maturity date was 48 hours away. If he didn't flip the house by Friday, the penalties would trigger immediate seizure of assets. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled through the fine print. This wasn't just financial incompetence anymore, it was dangerous negligence. Greg had invited a shark into the family swimming pool. Profit. He bragged about at dinner was a myth. He was scrambling to pay off a loan shark before the shark came to collect. Every smile, every toast, every confident promise was a desperate attempt to cover the sound of the executioner sharpening his axe. He was trapped, and he was dragging us all down. I clicked on the final attachment, labeled Additional Collateral. I expected to see Greg's car or maybe his watch. Instead, the screen displayed a scan of a retirement account statement. My breath hitched. It was my father's retirement account. The signature at the bottom was a shaky forgery of Dad's name. Greg hadn't just leveraged his own ruin. He had put my parents' golden years on the table as a bargaining chip. He wasn't just drowning. He was preparing to pull my parents into the abyss with him. The coffee shop smelled of burnt beans and aggressive optimism. I sat at a wobbly corner table, the manila folder resting under my hands like a loaded weapon. Chloe walked in 10 minutes late, her designer sunglasses hiding eyes that I knew were red, rimmed from sleeplessness. She ordered a decaf latte with almond milk, forcing a smile at the barista that didn't reach her cheeks. When she sat down, the mask slipped. She looked exhausted, vibrating with a nervous energy that made her hands shake. She wasn't ready for the truth. Greg says the presale interest is insane. Chloe gushed, unwinding her scarf. We're going to be rich, Megan. Finally, I didn't return her smile. Instead, I slid the unpaid contractor invoice across the scratched laminate. Greg isn't rich, Chloe. He's drowning. He owes Marco $25,000, and he hired him to demo a house I own. Chloe glanced at the paper, then shoved it back. Her denial was a physical reflex. He's managing cash flow. You wouldn't understand high-level finance. I understand fraud, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. And I understand that he doesn't have the deed. Chloe scoffed, her voice rising enough to turn heads at the next table. You've always been jealous of him. Because he has vision and you are stuck in your spreadsheets. She leaned in, her eyes hard. He's trying to build a legacy for Mom and Dad. Why do you have to be such a wet blanket? You are just trying to ruin this because you are miserable. I ignored the insult and laid down the printout of the Apex Capital loan. He borrowed $50,000 at 40% interest from a shark, Chloe. And he put Dad's retirement fund up as collateral. The color drained from her face instantly. She stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The confident wife act crumbled into dust. That's not possible, she whispered. He said the investors just needed proof of assets. He said it was just a formality. A cold knot formed in my stomach. He didn't have access to Dad's accounts. I said slowly. How did he get the statement to scan? Chloe looked down at her lap, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. He needed it quickly. She mumbled. Dad was golfing. Greg said, if we didn't send it by noon, we'd lose the deal. So I went into Dad's study. She looked up, tears spilling over. I signed the release form, Megan. I signed Mom and Dad's names. The air left the room. My sister wasn't just a victim of Greg's con. She was a co-conspirator. She had committed forgery to feed his gambling addiction disguised as business. You realize what you did? I asked, my voice trembling. If this loan defaults on Friday, Apex takes Dad's money, and you are the one who authorized it. Chloe covered her face with her hands. He promised it was safe, she sobbed. He swore on our lives. We just needed a bridge until the sale. I stood up, grabbing the folder. We are going to the police, Chloe. Before he destroys anything else. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. No police. She hissed, her eyes wild with panic. You can't arrest him. Megan. She pressed my hand against her stomach, hidden beneath the loose sweater. I am 12 weeks pregnant. If he goes to jail, I have nothing. This house flip is the only way we can afford the baby. She was carrying the next generation while destroying the last. The drive to the coast was a blur of gray asphalt and white, knuckle fury. I pulled into the crushed shell driveway, just as the sun dipped below the dunes, casting long, bruised shadows across the property. The house didn't look like a renovation project. It looked like a victim. Debris littered the yard, shards of siding and splintered wood that I recognized as the original cedar shake. The front door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the ocean breeze. Greg hadn't just breached the perimeter, he had abandoned it. I stepped over the threshold and stopped cold. The smell hit me first, a pungent mix of raw sawdust and wet plaster. The living room, once a cozy sanctuary of knotty pine, was a skeleton. The non-load, bearing wall separating the kitchen was gone, ripped out with zero finesse, leaving jagged electrical wires hanging from the ceiling like severed arteries. Dust coated everything, turning the air hazy and suffocating. This wasn't an improvement. It was a butchery of a home that had stood for 3 generations. My eyes darted to the space above the stone fireplace. For 40 years, my grandfather's collection of antique nautical maps had hung there, framed in heavy oak. Now, only 3 pale rectangles remained on the suit, stained brick, marking where history used to live. I walked over, my boots crunching on broken drywall. The brass hooks were empty. He hadn't just demowed the walls, he had looted the decor. Greg was stripping the house for parts to pawn before the bank seized everything. A rhythmic beeping drew me into the kitchen. The old yellow landline, the one we never disconnected, was flashing angry red. I pressed the play button, my finger leaving a clean streak in the dust. A man's voice, raspy and bored, filled the empty room. "Mr. Collins, this is Apex. You missed the 2 p.m. check-in. If the wire isn't cleared by close of business, we initiate the default clause. Don't make us come down there." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. The crunch of tires on gravel shattered the silence. I froze, glancing out the kitchen window. Greg's leased sedan pulled up next to my car, followed closely by a flashy convertible. He jumped out, wearing a suit that looked too shiny for a construction site, and ushered a heavy, set man toward the porch. He was doing a showing. He was actually trying to sell the property right now, while I stood inside. The audacity wasn't just stunning, it was pathological. He truly believed he could talk his way out of physics. I considered hiding in the pantry, but the forensic accountant in me died, replaced by the furious daughter. I stood my ground in the center of the ruined living room. Voices drifted in from the foyer. "It's a blank canvas," Greg was saying, his voice pitched high with manic charm. "You can really see the potential now that we've opened it up. Cash offers get priority, of course." He was selling a lie inside a crime scene. I crossed my arms and waited for the curtain to rise. Greg stepped into the room, sweeping his arm wide like a ringmaster. "And here is the great room." He choked on the words when he saw me. His smile faltered, twitching into a grimace of pure panic before he tried to recover. "Oh, and this is our interior designer, Megan." The man beside him didn't look like a buyer. He wore a cheap suit and looked at the walls with predatory boredom. "Designer?" The man grunted. "She looks like she's ready to evict us." "I am not the designer," I said, my voice cutting through air like a scalpel. I stepped forward, ignoring Greg's frantic eye signals to play along with his charade. "I'm the owner, and you are trespassing on private property." The heavy, set man stiffened, his eyes darting between Greg's sweating face and my rigid posture. Greg laughed, a nervous, hacking sound that bounced off the exposed studs. "She loves to joke," he stammered, reaching for the man's arm. "Family humor. We're actually finalizing the paperwork tonight." The lie hung there, rotting. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out the original deed, the heavy cream paper seemingly glowing in the dim light. I slapped it onto the dust, covered kitchen island with a sound like a gunshot. Read the name Greg. It's not Mom. It's not Dad. And it certainly isn't you. The stranger didn't wait for permission. He snatched the document up, his thick fingers leaving smudges on the text. He scanned it, his expression hardening into concrete. The air in the room turned instantly violent. You took 50 grand from me yesterday. The man growled, dropping the paper. He wasn't looking at the house anymore, he was looking at Greg's throat. You said you held title. You said clear sailing. Greg backed up until he hit the stripped wall, his hands raised in surrender. It's a misunderstanding, Tony. A family trust issue. We can fix this. Tony took a step forward, invading Greg's personal space. Fixing it involves my money back in my hand. Now, the predator became the prey. The front door swung open again, bringing a gust of wind and the cheerful sound of my mother's voice. Surprise! We brought champagne. My parents stood in the entryway, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon. Their smiles faltering as they took in the scene. They saw the debris. They saw the stranger cornering their son, in-law. They saw me standing like an executioner by the island. My father's grip on the bottle tightened until his knuckles turned white. What is going on here? He demanded, his voice trembling. Greg saw his lifeline. He scrambled toward them, pointing a shaking finger at me. She's sabotaging the deal, David! I have a buyer right here, ready to save us, and Megan is waving fake papers around. My mother looked at me, confusion warring with her habitual loyalty to him. Megan, please. She begged, clutching her purse against her chest. Greg is working so hard for us. Don't cause a scene? It was the same old song. They were asking me to set myself on fire to keep him warm. He isn't working for you, I said, walking to the pile of drop cloths in the corner. He's stealing from you. I kicked the canvas aside, revealing the stack of framed nautical maps hidden beneath. The glass on the top one was cracked. My father gasped. The sound sharp and painful. Those maps were his pride, his connection to his own father. Greg hadn't sent them for restoration. He had stashed them to sell at a pawn shop. The visual proof finally cracked the denial wide open. And he didn't stop at the maps. I continued, turning to the stranger named Tony. Show them the loan application. Tony, realizing his money was gone unless he cooperated, pulled a crumpled document from his jacket. He held it up for my father to see. Signature looked familiar. Tony sneered. My father squinted at the paper. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. He recognized his own name, signed by a hand that wasn't his. The hero worship in his eyes died instantly. The room went silent, save for the wind howling through the open door. Greg looked around, realizing he had no allies left. The charm evaporated, replaced by a snarling, ugly desperation. You ungrateful little witch, he spat, turning on me with venom. I was trying to make us millions. You ruined everything with your petty jealousy. He took a menacing step toward me, his fists clenched tight. You think a piece of paper makes you the boss. I'm the man of this house. I make the decisions. He lunged, knocking the champagne bottle from my father's hand. It shattered on the floor, exploding in a spray of glass and foam. My mother screamed. I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this moment since the dinner toast. Greg was a cornered rat, and rats always bite. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep with bruising force. Give me the deed, he hissed. His face inches from mine, smelling of sweat and fear. Give it to me, or I swear to God. He never finished the threat. Blue and red lights washed over the living room walls, pulsing through the windows like a strobe light. The sound of heavy boots on the porch stairs followed instantly. His grip loosening just enough for me to pull away. I looked past him, through the ruined frame of the door, to where Marco stood in the driveway next to a patrol car. I hadn't just come to talk. I had come to clean house. The officers stepped inside, hands on belts. The officers wasted no time. One stepped between Greg and me, hand resting on his holster, while the other spun my brother-in-law around. The sound of ratcheting handcuffs cut through the room, louder than the wind. Greg shouted about misunderstandings, but his voice cracked with panic. My mother sobbed into her hands, unable to watch as they marched him past the shattered champagne bottle. Tony, the lender, simply shook his head and walked out the back, cutting his losses. The performance was finally over. The curtain had fallen hard. 2 hours later, the police station waiting room smelled of stale coffee and harsh industrial cleaner. My parents sat on plastic chairs, looking small and gray under the fluorescent buzz. I stood by the vending machine, watching the analog clock tick slowly. The door burst open and Chloe rushed in, her coat thrown over her pajamas. She looked wild, eyes searching the room until they landed on me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She marched straight to me, fueled by terror and a deeply misplaced loyalty. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "They said he's being booked for grand larceny." "You did this." My father stood up, trying to hush her, but the damage was done. Chloe wasn't seeing a criminal, she was seeing her husband being persecuted. "You couldn't just talk to him. You had to call the cops." She poked my chest hard. "He's family. You don't put family in a cage. You just wanted to humiliate him because you are jealous of our life." My mother wiped her eyes and took my hand. Her skin felt paper, thin and cold. "Megan, let's not make this worse," she pleaded. "We can drop the charges. Tell them it was a mix-up." My father nodded, looking sick to his stomach. "We can pay bail. Get him a lawyer. We can't let this ruin his life. Think about the baby. Think about the scandal." They were asking me to be the fixer again. They wanted the accountant to fudge the numbers of reality one last time. I pulled my hand away, the physical separation marking the end of my compliance. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "I am not dropping charges. I am not posting bail." My mother gasped. "He stole Grandpa's maps." I continued, voice steady. "He gutted the house. He forged Dad's signature. This isn't a mistake, Mom. It's a predator feeding on us." I looked at my father. "If I pay his bail, I am paying for my own abuse. I won't do it." Dad tried to argue, claiming Greg just got in over his head. I didn't let him finish. I pulled out the Apex Capital loan application, the one with the forgery. "Look at the collateral, Dad," I said, shoving it under his nose. "He put your retirement fund on the line. If I hadn't stopped the deal tonight, you would be destitute by Monday." My father stared at the paper. He traced his fake signature with a trembling finger. The denial finally broke, shattered by the ink. He swore that money was safe. My father whispered, the betrayal finally sinking in. He looked at Chloe, his eyes hardening. "Did you know?" Chloe sobbed. "He said it was temporary. He said he'd pay it back double." My father turned away, disgust radiating off him. "You let him gamble with my life," he said. "Megan is right. He stays in that cell tonight." The family front had cracked. It was no longer us against the world. It was us against the parasite, and Chloe was the host. I turned to my sister. She looked shattered, a child waiting for someone to fix her mess. "You have a choice," I told her, my tone clinical. "You can stay here and wait for a husband who will steal your child's future, or you can go home with Mom and Dad." Chloe looked at the holding cell door, then at our parents. The fantasy was dead. The rich husband was a convict. "He has nothing, Chloe," I added. "And now, neither do you. Make the choice." We walked out into the damp night air. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and black. In the parking lot, a tow truck was backing up to Greg's sedan. A man in a jumpsuit was hooking heavy chains to the axle. Hey! Chloe shouted instinctively, but she didn't run toward it. She knew. The lease payments were months behind. Even his getaway car didn't belong to him. Watching it get hoisted into the air felt like watching a tombstone being set. The symbol was gone. Chloe climbed into the backseat of my parents' car, weeping softly. My father sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at nothing. He looked 10 years older than he had at dinner. I stood by my own car, watching them pull away. They were broken, but they were safe. The parasite had been excised. I got into my driver's seat and locked the doors. The silence inside wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. The fever had finally broken, leaving us weak but alive. 6 months later, the roar of the ocean was the only loud thing at the beach house. I knelt on the warm mahogany planks, running a sanding block over the grain. The wood felt alive under my fingertips, smooth and sun-baked. Marco worked beside me, whistling a tune that didn't sound angry anymore. We weren't tearing things down. We were healing them. The salty air smelled of cedar and sawdust, a perfume of restoration. "Hand me the grit," Marco said, pointing to the bucket. He wasn't chasing a check. He was building art. The screen door creaked, but I didn't flinch. Chloe stepped out, balancing a tray of cold lemonade. She looked different without the designer sunglasses and the desperate smile. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore a stained T-shirt that belonged to me. "I think the railing needs one more pass," she said, setting the tray down. She picked up a brush, maneuvering around her swollen belly, her movements slow but deliberate. She wasn't supervising anymore. The princess had vanished, leaving a woman who was finally learning to earn her keep. A familiar sedan, crunching on the gravel, announced my parents. They walked up the driveway, carrying grocery bags, but their steps were tentative. There was no champagne today. My father stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the restored deck with a mixture of shame and awe. He didn't breeze past me to claim the head of the table. "Is it all right if we start the grill?" he asked, his voice soft. He was asking for permission. The dynamic had shifted permanently. I was the captain now. I went inside to grab plates, walking through the living room we had painstakingly rebuilt. The knotty pine was back, salvaged from a reclamation yard. Above the fireplace, the 3 rectangular voids were filled. I had paid to have the cracked frames restored the day after the arrest. They hung straight and true, guiding us home. But the most important addition was in the hallway. A simple black frame held the deed to the property. It wasn't a trophy. It was a boundary line. It reminded everyone whose roof protected them. We ate as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in bruised purples. The conversation was quiet, focused on simple things like the tide and the paint color for the shed. Nobody mentioned Greg. His name was a ghost we had exorcised. Chloe laughed at a joke Marco made. A genuine sound that didn't cost anything. My mother passed the salad, her hand lingering on my shoulder for a second. It was an apology she couldn't voice. We weren't performing for an audience. We were just a family eating dinner. As stars appeared, I poured a glass of iced tea. I walked to the edge of the deck, leaning against the sturdy mahogany railing that would outlast us all. The contractor was paid. The mortgage was mine. The family was safe, even if they were humbled. I raised my glass to the horizon, echoing that toast from 6 months ago. But I didn't promise profit. I promised protection. The house wasn't flipped for a quick buck. It was anchored deep, held fast by the one person who knew its true worth.